Hello, I am making a video today ranking many of the important countries that took part in World War II, and I'll be ranking these countries based on what I personally think their performance, how well they perform militarily on the battlefield during the course of the war. And it's obviously going to be subjective, but here's my take on the different countries. So I'll start off with the United States. The United States is obviously has a great military. The United States sent in many troops, and they operated very successfully in many parts of the Western Front and North Africa. It was only at Kasserine Pass that they were inhibited by Rommel, but other than that, they were totally successful on the North African front as well as the British. In Europe, their landings in Sicily and in Normandy were terrifically successful, and the American advance just into France and central Germany could not be more successful, I think. And the United States generally sent in good forces into Europe. And as for the Pacific, their navy was well equipped and their soldiers fought well. They liberated many Pacific Islands. They reconquered the Philippines. The United States Navy and Army and the entire U.S. Armed Forces were performed pretty well on the battlefield. Brazil sent in not too many forces. As far as I know, I think they sent in one division to the Italian front, the 1st Brazilian Infantry Division, which managed to push along with the Americans into northern Italy. But since there isn't that much to tell from, I'm going to say that Brazil is a pretty average country. Russia, or wait, I'm assuming this is Soviet Union, so this is probably Slovakia. Slovakia was not a terrific military by any means, right? Slovakia sent in 3 divisions to the invasion of Poland. They sent in a little expeditionary corps to the Eastern Front during Barbarossa. Slovakia did not participate much, although they participated sufficiently for their size, in my opinion. They were an independent state, but they were a puppet of Germany, and thus they did not have the independence to train their own military. But in cooperation with Germany, they performed okay. Not horrible, but they were not very good. I'll put them in C tier. British Raj sent in many forces into North Africa and the Pacific, and as well as Europe. India generally fought well, I think. The Battle of Imphal is a great example of it. There are parts in its military history of World War II in which Indian divisions and brigades fought poorly, such as the Malayan campaign. But in my opinion, for example, the 11th Indian Division, it's not the Indian soldiers' fault. It's the commanders who were British, and I don't think it's fair to blame the British Raj for such inadequate defenses. As for other parts like the Burma theater and the North African theater, I think that India fought pretty well, and it was almost single-handedly Indian troops that I think saved uh, the Burmese front, and Indian troops also played a part in the invasion of Iraq in 1941. I think India can go in B tier. Bulgaria is a country that did not fight too much. Bulgaria was active in the Balkan campaign as it marched into Macedonia and into Greek Macedonia, into southern Serbia along with the Germans. But they sent in no substantial forces to the Eastern Front, and when the Soviets came knocking on their door in 44, they pretty much pulled a Romania and swapped sides, their government collapsing and the communists overthrowing. Bulgaria didn't have much to show. I'm going to put them in I'll put them in D tier because they were not terrific. France started out as a terrific army. They were great. They were the most powerful army in the world, in my opinion, in 1939, and in 1940 were they were still a very tough military. They had a chance to stop Germany. It was the only problem was the decisions of French commanders like Gamelin and Charles Hunziker, who really messed things up in the Sedan campaign, the Battle of Sedan, as well as the progress right before Dunkirk with the Battle of Arras. The French failed to collaborate with the British and Belgian armies as well as with itself. So I think France can be blamed for that. But as for their actions after it, the Free French performed relatively well in the Syrian campaign, and the raid on Dakar was poorly organized, but they played a good part in Overlord. So I'll put them in B tier because France was a good army, but they were not terrific. Australia was not a horrible army, but they were not terrific either. They were standard. The 8th Australian Infantry Division in El Alamein, I think was useful to be there. The Australian Navy, Chris was very effective. Just the Australian Navy in general was effective, but only about as effective as the Americans or the British, not to any exceptional degree. And Australians, yes, I think that Australians fought well in North Africa as well as in the Pacific. I think I'll put them in B tier. Now, Belgium is a country that had 22 infantry divisions in a little group, Group K, after on the onset of the German invasion on May 10th, 1940. Belgium stood strong. For its position, no one expected Belgium to be able to withstand Germany. So Belgium fought well for its situation, and I think that the strategy of the Dille plan really compromised Belgium, and the fact that the Belgian borders, its frontiers, were guarded by Belgian troops, and the French only wanted to advance after the Belgian forces were sacrificed, really gave the Belgian army no chance. So I'll put it in C tier because they never had any especially great chances, and they never performed exceptionally. They lost every battle for the most part, and when they surrendered on the 28th, Belgium left with no military successes and only failure, and there are no important battles in Belgium Congo. The Canadian Armed Forces, I think, could easily be A tier. And the reason for that is because The Dieppe raid was unsuccessful, but the Canadian forces cannot be forgotten. Their efforts were very worthwhile for the war effort, and Canadian forces were very useful in the battle for Normandy, as well as in the second fall of France, or the liberation of France. I think Canada deserves an A tier alongside the United States. Colombia sent in few forces. In all honesty, I do not know much about the Colombian armed forces in World War II. I believe they sent in a tiny company to the European front and none to Pacific. And I don't know much about it, but since I'm not aware of any great successes, nor any great failures. I have to put them in B tier until I learn more about it, because I frankly know close to nothing about Colombian forces. Now, Croatia is an interesting one. It sent one regiment over to the Eastern Front in Stalingrad, and that was about it. The Croatian Legion. And the Croatian Legion fought better than the average German division, the average German regiment. They were much superior to their German counterparts, but they were very small. They were limited. And Croatia never sent any units to the Western Front. And I mean, sure, they were also pretty useful for the Axis in quelling the rebellions, to quell the partisan uprisings in Yugoslavia. But Croatia was not particularly exceptional, but I think it was above average, so it's between A and B, but I think their actions on the Eastern Front proved them above B tier. And Cuba is another country like Colombia that I do not know much about their actions on any front. So for the same reasons, I will place them in B tier. They joined in the war pretty early, pretty much at the same time that the United States did, and they were trying to join the war beforehand as well. But the fact that only Canada was really the only North American or country in the entire Americas that was at war with the Axis, they didn't want to. But once the United States was attacked and joined the war, Cuba was more than willing to join the war. And I believe they sent in a small force to the Western Front, and I am not aware of any troops that Cuba sent to the Pacific. Denmark, the famous 4.5 or 5 hour surrender country, cannot be remembered for anything good. They lost the Faroe Islands later. They got Iceland occupied, although it was pretty much independent, but became occupied by the British, and Greenland became occupied by the United States. Denmark was pretty much useless. I don't think, I don't think it served any good. Its two divisions didn't even fight much because of the Danish government surrendering within a few hours of the assault. Now, Ethiopia had good resistance against the Italians, especially for the kind of weaponry they had. I think they deserve some respect. Ethiopia was conquered by Italy during the second Ilo-Ethiopian War, and they tried to regain control of their country, and that only happened after the British and Commonwealth forces were able to take over Ethiopia and Somalia, and then Ethiopia gained its sovereignty again, and the government returned. It did not have substantial organized military forces, so it does not deserve S tier or I also don't think it deserves A tier though, because it wasn't exceptional in any way. On the other hand, is Finland. I think Finland's a very easy S tier, and that's only because of the Winter War. During the Winter War, Finland fought against a much larger enemy, the Soviets, and especially the Finnish defenses north of Lake Ladoga were commendable. I think they encircled the Soviet forces, they created moptis, and they destroyed their tanks without having any themselves, and were able to gun down large groups of Soviets, and sometimes just encircling and starving them out. Their fighting south of Lake Ladoga in the Karelian Isthmus was also great. They fought against a very large 7th Army, which later became split to 7th and 13th. And the Finnish 2nd and 3rd Corps held up for a long time. Just think about it, it's months and months. Sure, the terrain is not the same at all as it was in Poland, but I just think Poland was outnumbered only 2-1, and it fell in a month. And Finland only, the Mannerheim line only broke months. It only broke in February, after more than 3 months of fighting in the Isthmus. So I think Finland certainly deserves a place in S tier. Germany is another country that fought rather exceptionally, and Germany fought on many fronts, of course. They were useful in the North African front. We all know the story of the Deutsches Afrika Korps, and while of course it ended up failing, as did all German fronts, I think they all fought exceptionally well. So Germany can go in either S tier or A tier as countries that fought very well. I think they can go in A tier. Hungary is mediocre, I think, but also they did not prepare they did not prepare successfully for any campaign, be it the Balkans campaign or the Eastern Front in Stalingrad, or in even the Romanian front, or the Soviet invasion of Hungary. I think the Hungarian armed forces did not have much of a chance after Germany basically conquered their ally in 44, but their role in the invasion in 41 of North Yugoslavia was poor, to say the least. And Hungary never acquired a chance to redeem themselves. I wouldn't say they were bad in the Eastern Front, but they weren't exceptionally great either. I think they were of mediocre quality in the Battle of Stalingrad. Luxembourg is a country with, I believe, less than 500 defenders. It's a part of their national police, so there's not much to say. It fails for the same reason that Denmark does. It didn't have a defense. It essentially didn't defend against Germany at all. And for that reason, it deserves D tier. Mexico sent in, I believe, 1 brigade over to the Western Front, which fought in Italy. And Mexico, that Mexican brigade, it was similar to the Brazilian division in that they were useful, they did their job, and they were no less bad than any American or British or Canadian or Polish unit were in the North African or in the Italian theater. I think Mexico's good in the B tier, as they were average. Now, Nepal's Gurkhas were not terrific. Nepal was not a good contributor to the war. I think Nepal does not deserve anything higher than C tier because they sent in close to nothing. It was only on September 4th, 1939, when they declared a war that they started to mobilize, and when they mobilized some troops to defend India. Okay? India already had defenders. I'm sure India would not have complained that Nepal added defenders to India, but due to religious reasons, the Nepali troops were banned from leaving by sea to any part of the world that they couldn't travel by land. So India was where they were stuck to. They were not ever sent to North Africa. They were never sent to the Pacific Theater. I think Nepal can actually be given D tier for its poor quality. New Zealand is something different. New Zealand's 2nd Infantry Division was very, very active and useful in both the Crete campaign, Greece, and then Crete, as well as North Africa. They performed well in Operation Crusader as well as in the Battle of El Alamein, and they continued to do well in the North African campaign, and afterwards they were pretty much a standard unit in Europe. I think New Zealand has to be either A tier or S tier. They're high A tier, I will put them, because New Zealand was a pretty useful, very useful army in the war for the British, and they did more than their fair share of war contributions. Few more. I think we should speed it up a little bit. Norway fell after more than 2 months. They lasted month and 15 days in the 2 months and 15 days in the war, much longer than France did. They fell on I believe the 10th of June. So this actually a month in a day. I think 2 months in a day. I think Norway was not exceptional, but it was not poor. It's not down here, but it's also not here. It's not S. I think it could be anywhere A, B, or C. But then, I think what could decide where Norway falls is the Norwegian forces after the fall of Norway. And I think they fought relatively well. They did not fight poorly, but they were not incredibly effective. So they can go on B tier. Poland is a country that fought very early on. They were the first country, other than Germany, that was involved in the European theater of the war. And although Poland fell, they fought terrifically, and I go over that in other videos. But Poland was an exceptional fighter in North Africa and in Italy and in the Western Front as well. They served on the French front during the German invasion in May 1940. They had 2 divisions over in France. The Polish army after the fall of Poland was absolutely essential in the Italian campaign, especially early on. So they have to go A tier, if not legendary. And the reason why I would put them at S tier is because they did not have a homeland that they could return to. And like what the Czechoslovak Legion did in 1919 and 1920, Poland still fought on in different parts of the world in order to bring the downfall of Nazi Germany and to ensure that that the Polish homeland would be secured after war. Of course, unfortunately for them, at least for the non-communist Poles, the Soviets would attain control over Poland, and Poland would be subjugated under the Eastern Bloc until its collapse. Romania is a decent fighter. I think they did not fight poorly in the Eastern Front. They were all pretty much useless when it came to the Balkans, the Balkan theater, and I think they took way too long to seize Odessa in the on the onset of Barbarossa, and um, and they just became a victim of an attack in Constanta. I could not say that they were a good fighting force. Now South Africa, so there's a first South African infantry division, and there's a second South African infantry division. Now both of those fought in North Africa in Crusader and in Al Alamein. I think Pienaar is a poor general. I don't know about the other one as much. And South Africa, as far as I know, had no contribution to Normandy or to Italy. It was pretty much North Africa that they stayed at, they won at, they returned home. South Africa also played a part in the East African campaign in the invasion of Ethiopia and Somalia. There was a South African brigade which was used to win that campaign. But I would not say that they were a terrific army, but they're not poor. I'll put them on C tier. Now, Thailand, the Thai armed forces were just generally useless. They collabed with the Japanese after getting occupied. And they did not do much, not even in Burma. They did not play as much a part as you'd expect a country bordering Burma to play. And they were pretty much isolated and pretty much a Japanese client state, but not a useful client state like, say, Slovakia was to Germans, because they didn't even send in 3 divisions. So D tier. Mongolia, no one expects highly of them, but it didn't do anything great. But I cannot put them in D tier because they had no opportunity to do much. But unlike Luxembourg, I know it's a little cheating to go to events that happened before, but it's only slightly before the Nomonhan incident. Mongolian troops succeeded in few operations, especially for a small army like that. It deserves something higher than D tier. The Filipinos were absolutely great at their defense during the Japanese invasion. It was not their fault, nor was it the Americans' fault that it collapsed. The Japanese were just too strong, and the Americans were too far away. And even after the collapse, the withdrawal from Bataan, Filipino militants continued to fight on against the Japanese. I must commend that. So the Philippines was a great fighting force, either S or A tier. I'll put them in high A tier. China is poor to say the least. They did not fight effectively. They had a ton of troops, so much manpower, and although they did not get as many resources as they should have because of the Burma Road closing for some time and the road through Indochina completely being occupied, I don't think that China was an effective fighting force. So China belongs either in C or D tier. C or D tier. And I'll put them in D tier actually because China was not doing its job. It killed 1 million people uh, by flooding the Yangtze River. Um, and sure, it may have delayed a Japanese advance to Wuhan, but it yeah, they sacrificed their own civilians in order to maintain a little military achievement, which was not even certain. And of course, although they did fight well in certain battles like Xingsha and Zhaoying Yicheng, um, they completely collapsed on Ichigo. And although they fought well, they even fought with themselves against the communists. So I don't think the Chinese deserve any more than a D in terms of ranking. And the United Kingdom and the British Empire were absolutely essential for the war effort. I say this again, but many of the failures on part of the on part of Commonwealth troops in different campaigns are not their faults and rather the British faults. It's the fault of the British officers, and because they are British, not from those countries like India or Australia or Canada, New Zealand, sometimes, not all of them, oftentimes they are, but sometimes these commanders are British, and Britain deserves blame. Britain was not a poor country, and despite all of those failures, they pretty much single-handedly held on against Germany for over a year, and they deserve good credit for that. A tier. Yugoslavia can be split into two parts: before their collapse and after their collapse. Before their collapse, they were absolutely poor. They'd be below China. They'd be D tier because they could not hold on to anything. They got encircled, and then they got encircled again. They surrendered. They collapsed without being able to produce a good defense. Croatians in its army deserted and even joined against the Serbs. Yugoslavia had a disastrous army, but afterwards the Yugoslav army was very effective in its resistance. I would argue it's the best resistance in Europe during the war. So in terms of that, it would be S tier. But how would I average out D tier and S tier? Well, I can't just do it based on what did they spend more time on. I have to grade it on which operation was more impactful, which operation ended up using more troops. And the answer to that is the Balkans campaign when Yugoslavia completely collapsed. So it will be closer to D than to S. So it wouldn't be B. It would be between B and C, and I put in C because although it played terrific partisan activities, its completely disastrous failure during the German invasion of Yugoslavia is a testament of poor Yugoslav planning and just pure disorganization of its armed forces. And now we have the Red Army. The Red Army is a little controversial because, of course, it's the army that single-handedly played the most part in terms of both the raw numbers and in terms of impact, I think, on the course of the war. But its armies were not well equipped. They sacrificed a ton of men. I don't like it when people say the Soviet Union was a great fighting force because it lost so many men in Stalingrad. I think if anything, that should be a testament of its poor quality. and it was certainly lacking in supplies and lacking in good good generals, especially because of the purge. So it was not a great fighting force, and I'll put it in C tier. The Italians often get berated for its poor practices in North Africa as well as in the Greek campaign. And while that's true, the Italian Navy was very effective. It was the Italian Air Force that bombarded Bahrain and Dammam in Saudi Arabia. And it was the Italians who initially had conquered and maintained control of Ethiopia, albeit not in such a clean manner. But they held on, they invaded Somaliland, they captured Kassala, although they had to withdraw from it. The Italians were a vital part in North Africa. Germany could have never held on to North Africa on its own. It needed that Italian force, and the Italian forces had to be in the majority. And although we can all agree that Italy failed completely in the Greek campaign of 1940 and early 1941, it played useful parts in other places. Its Alpine front against France during the closing days of the Battle of France were inadequate and poor, frankly. So all of those things considered, I'd say Italy was a below average fighting force, but it was not D tier like some people would say. I'll place Italy in the C tier. The IJA, let's begin with. Let's begin with the IJA. The IJA fought, frankly, very poorly in both in Burma and in New Guinea and in China. Considering their strength and their size, they should have been able to conquer much more of China than they did. They should have been able to reach Chongqing by 1941. And yet, especially considering the weakness of the Chinese forces they were facing. Yes, the Japanese did well in Malaya, but I don't think that's because of the Japanese doing great. I think it's because the British were poor. The British were playing horribly in Malaya, not the Japanese doing great. I think the Japanese did pretty well in Burma. They did below expectations in the Philippines, and they did much below expectations in New Guinea. The IJN was much better than almost. I think the IJN was the second best navy in the world, only behind the United States. I think it was even better than the British Navy in many aspects. But I'm no naval expert. The Japanese Navy was fighting very well up until a few close battles, Coral Sea and Midway, that really turned it around for the Japanese. But they were generally an effective naval fighting force, though their army was not too good. I think they deserve B tier. Greece Greece has legendary fighting in the Greco-Italian War, and it was only when the Germans started invading and just completely destroying Greece completely that they collapsed. I think Greece was one of the best fighting forces in the entire war. They were one of the most resilient countries, and even when their mainland fell, they still fought in Crete with British and New Zealander help. The Greeks were um, were great fighters. They were resilient and persistent, and I hold strong respect for Finland, Poland, and Greece in their valiant fights, regardless of the side they were on. So this is my list: S tier. And by the way, the tiers I just have in any order. I don't have, Brazil is the best, it's high B, and Japan is low B. It's not that, it's just that these are the 5 categories. Think S tier goes Finland, Poland, and Greece. A tier is the United States, Canada, Croatia, Germany, New Zealand, Philippines, and the UK. B tier is Brazil, India, France, Australia, Colombia, Cuba, Ethiopia, Mexico, Norway, and Japan. And C is Slovakia, Belgium, Hungary, Romania, South Africa, Mongolia, Yugoslavia, Soviet Union, and Italy. D tier has Bulgaria, Denmark, Luxembourg, Nepal, Siam, or Thailand, and in nationalist China. So that is my list of countries fighting in World War II. Apologies for any ad distractions. I try my best to cut off the edges to eliminate such distractions, but this shall be my list. I think it's a good site. It's called Tiermaker.com, by the way. Should give credit. Tiermaker.com. And this particular map is called Countries Involved in World War II. And its tag number is 1554657. So I'll say countries performance in World War II, ranked, and yep, that should be my rank by Pacificus mapping. And yep, thank you. Hope you enjoyed that video.